Welcome to the Startup Grind.
So the other tradition we have at Startup Grind when we talk is to start right at the beginning and ask, where did you grow up and what you wanted to be?
Great.
You know?
There it goes. So I grew up in Minnesota, which is very cold and landlocked and right in the middle of the U.S., if anybody doesn't know. And I don't think I was sure what I wanted to be until I was in college. I think what I sort of learned is that I like to learn things and apply them. I don't just want to learn them for the sake of learning them, but I like to learn things and then be able to do something with the thing that I just learned. And so eventually I think that's what drew me to research, is because you can, or applied research in particular, where you can find stuff out and then somebody does something with that information very quickly, hopefully, and that thing that you found out can make a difference.
So probably what everyone is wondering, how you went from Minnesota to New Zealand?
Yeah, so there was a stop in between in Massachusetts. I grew up in Minnesota. I did all of my degrees in Massachusetts, including a PhD. And at the time that I did my PhD, US PhDs in marketing were really marketable all around the world. So I almost viewed my PhD as like a passport to go live where I wanted to live, which turned out to be here. There was a lot about New Zealand that kind of attracted me, and then I came down. I had job offers from 3 of the universities and came down and looked and just kind of fell in love with the place, and it's stuck ever since.
Yeah. So that took you to, you were based in Wellington from the start, is that right? Or?
No, Canterbury at first.
Canterbury, okay, yeah, so further south, yeah. How did you find going from somewhere like Minnesota to starting up, especially with the studying you'd done and stuff like that, to like not really a small town, but smaller than probably where you were?
Yeah, I mean, I love both Christchurch and Wellington and Dunedin for those reasons, in the sense that they're all so walkable. I mean, Auckland's a very nice city, but to me it's kind of like a US city in the sense that you guys spend a lot of time in cars. But what I really liked about Christchurch, this is obviously the pre-earthquake Christchurch, and Wellington too, is that you can get anywhere very quickly, mostly on foot. If you're in the car, it's for like 10 minutes.
Yeah. So obviously you did all your education. What was your first paying job? What was the first thing you did?
A very first paying job would have actually been, I think, wrapping presents for my dad and my brother for 25 cents a present, because they were bad at it and I was good at it. And so like Christmas time, cleaned up as a little kid.
Yeah, nice. First paying job, using your skills then.
To exploit my family members,
yeah. Okay, cool. So obviously then you came back here, you decided to teach. Was that something you always wanted to do as well, or was it just the university job came about?
No, well, I think two things. Before I went back for my PhD, between my MBA and my PhD, I worked in the pharmaceutical industry. And I was a product manager on fertility drugs, and it was at the time that fertility drugs were really making a lot of innovations. In fact, it's actually how I met a lot of New Zealanders in the first place, because a lot of the research that was done on fertility drugs was done here in sheep, and then eventually moved on to humans. But it was really interesting because like the US doctors were kind of very good at what they did, but just very up themselves too, whereas the Kiwi doctors were very good at what they did and were completely down to earth and funny and fun and things like that, and that kind of stuck in my head. But also in doing that, what I saw that really impressed me was how quickly research was going from the lab to practice, because at that time there were these massive developments happening, and you could see, I would have known that the study was happening, the study gets published, and then practitioners are using it in their offices all within the space of a year. And I guess that made me think, wow, the research stuff is very powerful. At the same time, again, for that company that I was working for, I did the first study of US in vitro fertilization centers, because it was at the time that was really commercializing. And what I saw was the drugs that are used for in vitro fertilization are also used for just more garden variety fertility problems, ovulation induction. And the company didn't yet really understand, is this going to be a different market for us, or basically are we just going to sell some more? But this survey I did found that the way that doctors were using them for those two different procedures was completely different. You use a lot more drugs for in vitro fertilization than you do for kind of the garden variety fertility problems. And it meant a really completely different strategy for the company. So that again kind of got me hooked on, wow, you go get this information and something happens. So that was sort of what pushed me back to doing a PhD. And I sort of thought being an academic would kind of be like being a student all the time but getting paid. But it turns out it's not that way for anybody else who's thinking that way. There's like committee meetings and there's grading papers and there's a bunch of other stuff which isn't that fun really. But that's kind of what pushed me to it. And there's a lot that I really did like about teaching. It was fun, and it was also at that time, like I'm old enough, that it was at that time in New Zealand when a lot of stuff was changing. It was going from a very controlled economy with a lot of tariffs and things like that to a much more free market thing. And I really felt like, I do know about marketing. I can help with this, and that will be really cool.
So that led you on to, before you went over to the States, you started a business here as well.
Yeah. So I taught at Canterbury for 6 years, and then it was right around the time that the web was becoming a big thing, web surveys were becoming a big thing, online teaching became a possibility, and there was a lot of interesting stuff happening. And sort of for me, two things happened simultaneously. One of them was my partner and I bought this big lifestyle property down in the Mackenzie country and kind of wanted to build a house there rather than just a batch that we would go to once in a while. And so we were thinking of what could we do from down there that would use our skills and be interesting, but let us live down there. So that was one of the motivations. And then there was all of this other stuff happening in terms of the web, which allowed online education and which allowed web surveys. And I didn't really feel like Canterbury was fully embracing that at the time. And it was typical Canterbury fashion at the time. They were building buildings. Rather than thinking about, well, with all this technology, why don't we use that to deliver our classes rather than spending a whole lot of money building buildings that sit vacant a lot of the year that now have been wrecked in the earthquake anyway. And so I ended up, besides starting that company, teaching for one of the first online programs. There was this place called Cardigan University that was trying to do top quality MBA education online. So they had like Carnegie Mellon and Columbia and Stanford and the London Business School all trying to offer really top class MBA education online. And so it was back when the exchange rate was like 39 cents. So I could do that for 10 hours a week and then start my business in the rest of the week.
Yeah, and that probably would have been one of the first, because obviously there's loads now of online, like MBAs and mini degree, nano degrees and stuff like that you can do. That was one of the first companies doing that. It
was the first, and it's a great shame the way that market has evolved, because it started at the opposite end of where it's ended up, in the sense that what they were trying to do was better than what you're getting face-to-face, because they had all of these Nobel laureates on staff to help with content. They had learning experts to help with, how do you do this stuff online. They had user experience experts to do the interface and everything like that. The upshot was they were spending $1 million a course to develop these courses, but it looked like $1 million. I mean, you could see where that money went in the quality of the course. And they were targeting like Fortune 500 companies for their students and things like that. So it was a really like high expense but high quality product. And then after that came the University of Phoenix and all the others, and the market just kind of pulled downward, which I think is a great pity, because seeing that, what I saw was, all of the benefits that you can get from interactivity. And it was interesting because at the time that I was in Canterbury and saying I wanted to do this, people were saying, well, you don't get as personal education as you do in a face-to-face environment. And I said, I have classes with 300 people. I don't recognize them. Sometimes I would be in the line at the checkout at the supermarket and somebody would say, oh, I'm in your biz ad 316. And I'm like, I don't recognize you, but great. And so I think like it's sort of a myth that there is that sort of personal experience in the face-to-face, whereas in some of that interactive stuff, you can do it in your own time, you can do it from where you are. And because they were doing that well, there were all kinds of interesting little exercises and animation and things like that, which people do, I think, learn much better from than just somebody talking head standing up there, blah, blah, yellow lecture notes that have been around for the last 4 years.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And I mean, so leading on to that, the business that you owned on the side as well while doing that, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was started right at the time when web surveys had just become a thing. Like traditional market research was either, somebody comes to your house, somebody calls you up, they ask you a bunch of questions. But of course the web made it possible to do that online. And what was interesting at the time was that some market research companies were trying to do that, but they didn't know anything about the web, so they were trying to do it the same way that they might have done it if they came to your house. And so again, they weren't using the interactivity very well. By the same token, you had some tech companies trying to do the surveys, but they didn't know about surveys, so they asked like dumb questions, or they asked questions badly and things like that. So we saw an opportunity to kind of pull those two together and do good quality web surveys, and also maybe bring a level of analytical rigor to the level of market research that kind of really wasn't present here in many cases. And so that's sort of the market that we were targeting with that. We rode that for a while, and then as many of you know, subsequently there came a lot of off-the-shelf, do-it-yourself survey tools, like SurveyMonkey is the one that everybody knows. Qualtrics is the kind of higher caliber one. But now there's a bunch of those do-it-yourself tools, so that sort of was gradually going to become commoditized. And as we saw that happening, we also then saw an opportunity, kind of a similar one in virtual worlds. I don't know if you guys remember, because it wasn't as big of a thing here, but there was a phase in the US when Second Life, also in the UK, really hit and was a big thing. And there were a lot of big brands going into Second Life, which, if anybody doesn't know, is sort of a virtual world where you can go in and be represented by an avatar. So that got to be a really big thing. And we were the first commercial company to go and offer services in Second Life. And partly as a consequence of that, we also won this business plan competition that was judged by Silicon Valley venture capitalists, and that got us a lot of media attention. So we're sitting in the middle of the McKinsey country, which, let's face it, is the middle of nowhere. And we have these big name multinational clients in the US and UK. So it was super fun to kind of be that big fish in the small pond when all of that stuff was happening. Unfortunately, all of that stuff was happening right before the financial crisis. And so as the financial crisis came, companies were less willing to spend money on that sort of thing as they retrenched.
So when you started feeling that, I mean, when the financial crisis hit, was there the kind of thinking of, we could try and ride this out, or was it just like, that's us done, let's move on to something else?
No, it was hard to make that decision of when it was going to happen, I think for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, we did have some success with some really big name clients and things like that. Two, you didn't know, like, how, we know in retrospect how bad and how long the financial crisis was, but at the time it was hard to know. Three, as part of that too, besides the big commercial clients, we ended up having a lot of academic clients as well, because there were a ton of academic researchers doing research in Second Life, because it's got a lot of properties that made it really useful for them for research, including that they could get a much broader base of people to talk to. Whereas they're used to doing academic research where you have, your psychology 101 class and you're asking them questions, but of course they're not very diverse. Whereas in a place like Second Life, they could get people from other countries and all kinds of demographic groups and stuff like that. So we had a lot of these academic clients, and that business didn't dry up when the financial crisis hit. The corporate business did, but that business was never quite enough to kind of be a business on its own. Yeah, so it was a long time sort of figuring that out.
And putting back to it, I mean, those are two, the web surveys and Second Life, those are two things that you got in quite early. You identified there was opportunity there. I mean, for a lot of people that are kind of early entrepreneurs and startup founders and stuff, or even just thinking about doing something, how did you identify and go, okay, there is definitely an opportunity here? Was it something you were already, obviously the web surveys you were kind of already involved in a little bit, and then decided to start something, but was it something you were passionate about from the start, or was it just like, okay, there is an opportunity here, we need to dive in head first and be the first? Or? Yeah,
I think for me, it's often seeing the tool and then understanding the implications of that tool. So besides those two, I would also put the online education in that. Yeah. When you see the interactivity of the web and you think what that could do for education, and it's the same thing, see the web, wow, what does it mean for surveys? And the same thing, like the first time that I went in and saw Second Life and just thought about, wow, what does it mean for companies? I mean, it's kind of a shame that technology didn't take off more than it did, in the sense that you think of every company here. When we were working in Second Life, our next door neighbor was the BBC. And so you don't have to get on a plane to go to London. There they are next door neighbors, and it would feel like that. You could have meetings and things like that, and the whole tyranny of distance was just gone.
So you mentioned obviously you were working with, a lot of big names and stuff like that. When that sort of, when you decided, okay, let's move on to something else, is that when moving to San Fran came about? Like, how did you go back to the States? Where did that come into it?
Yeah, so there was an intermediate stop in Wellington in the sense that, so we wanted to live down there. We had this big, beautiful property, went through all this process of planting 1,000 trees, getting a massively long driveway in, getting telecom to install broadband in the middle of nowhere, building a house, doing all this stuff. And then we got down there and my allergies just went insane. So we went through 3 years of my allergies being insane and there was just nothing that could be done. So we ended up moving to Wellington. When we came back to Wellington, like the need to have that business kind of evaporated because the whole initial point was, you know, if we can work for ourselves, we can be where we want. So I had already been kind of trying to figure out, is there something to pivot to or are we just done and we need to move on? We were in the city so we could do more stuff. And then right as all that was happening, my parents sort of hit that age where they were having a lot of health problems. They were still in their house and they shouldn't have been. And my brother had issues with his own kids and was just kind of overwhelmed. And one day I just sort of got the SOS that said, need help here. And so at that point, I went back and spent a few months with my parents sort of trying to get them sorted out. And then it was clear like I kind of needed to be closer for a while. And so the Bay Area seemed to be the place to go because I think as we were doing the Second Life stuff in particular, it sort of always felt like pushing your nose up against Silicon Valley and looking in, but never quite being in, you know, like we were doing a lot of stuff with people there and what was going on there, but we weren't in the thick of it just because of our location. So it seemed like an opportunity to kind of take that road not traveled and see how it was, and still be close enough to my parents to help them out and things like that. So that's, and it was fun being in the epicenter of where technology is happening. Yeah.
So moving on to that as well, like, because obviously Apple came first before Flurry.
First and last, yeah.
Yeah, first and last, yeah. So you went to Apple. How did that come about? Did you applied like normal, or did they kind of headhunt you in, or what was the process behind that?
Yeah, the first time. I mean, people don't quite believe this, but it's true. The first time, I did just apply, like looked at a job on the website, was qualified for that job and applied for that job and ended up getting it. And I think people are really surprised at that. They would think that there's some sort of secret society, but no, you can apply. The second time through, it was different in the sense that when I resigned from Apple the first time to go to Flurry, like 12 hours later I got a phone call that said, no, you can't go because we have this other job that we have in mind for you. And so at that point we had a conversation about the other job, but they didn't have the head count. It wasn't officially approved or anything like that. So in the year while I was at Flurry, the wheels were turning at Apple to like get that head count approved and things like that. So by the time that Flurry was about to be sold to Yahoo and I was kind of ready, preferred to go back to Apple at that point, then the head count had been approved and so I went back. So that was a much more shoulder tapping thing, but the first one was just straight applying on the internet.
Yeah. So pulling back to the first one then, I know obviously we spoke beforehand and you kind of briefed me that you can't go into too much detail with Apple.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're under NDA for a lot of the project, like specifics and stuff you worked on. But tell us about the job then that you did and as much as you can.
Yeah.
Detail you can give about Apple would be good.
Yeah. It'll surprise no one to know that Apple's super security conscious. So my first job was doing analysis for Apple's iAd group. iAd is the part of Apple that deals with ads and apps. So if app developers are trying to monetize their app, iAd will help them source ads for that app. And at the time, it's changed a little bit. Now it's gone more self-service iAd, but at the time, it was very much targeting corporate clients. And at the time, corporate clients weren't quite sure about that mobile stuff. You know, like they were used to advertising on TV. They knew how that worked. They knew how you buy ads for TV. They knew like everything about TV. But mobile, you know, the screen is smaller. There was a whole lot about it that they just weren't sure of. And so a lot of my job was to pull through a lot of data, to be able to pull together the story for them about how are consumers using mobile devices, what mobile devices are they using, are their particular customers using mobile devices. It was amazing the preconceptions they would have, you know, like, I'm tired, I target moms don't use these devices, you know, but it's like, no, you know, so we would have the actual data to be able to say, well, is what you think about what your customers are doing with mobile true or not true? and also bring them a lot of granularity about not only that they're using mobile, but what kinds of apps are they using, what time of day do they use it, what devices are they using it on, yeah, that sort of stuff.
So you were mining that data and handing it over to someone else, or were you actually tracking it and using it? Like, how specific was your kind of role?
Yeah, so mine was taking a bunch of third-party data. That this is like an interesting Apple confidentiality thing, because Apple doesn't want its own data going to advertisers and wasn't going to hand it to them or anybody else. We were using a whole bunch of third-party data sets and pulling it together. And my job was going in and mining the data and then taking it through to the stage of slides and things like that that our sales force could use with talking to clients, and I could use with talking to clients. And a lot of it even too was educating our sales force, so that the sales force would have a lot of data available about, how are people using mobile in financial services, and then they'd use that to go talk to American Express. How are they using it in consumer products, and they use that to go talk to Procter & Gamble or whoever. So yeah, it was a lot of like starting from raw data and then going to something that somebody could walk into a client with, whether it was me or somebody else, to talk to them about why they should be advertising on mobile, why they should be advertising on iOS as opposed to Android, and why they should be using Apple's platform for advertising on iOS.
Exciting, wow, definitely.
Yeah, and it was fun because there was so much going on at that point in that whole space.
So then, obviously, Flurry, like Apple, obviously established at that point. Flurry, this was pre-sale to Yahoo.
Yeah.
So, did it feel like a lot more like a smaller startup, or were they already quite established in what they were doing at that point?
Yeah, there were a couple of things. I mean, the really big enticement to me, like kid in a candy store, let me at it kind of enticement, was at the time. Flurry, for anybody who doesn't know, Flurry does app analytics. So at the time that I worked for them, Flurry was doing analytics for about 500,000 apps, running on 1 billion devices. And I'd been itching to get my hands on big data for a couple of years at that point. And so the prospect of that much data was super exciting, and Flurry was on track to either IPO or be sold. And so it wanted to show the value of the data that it had, because that was obviously going to influence the price of either of those things. So my whole job was just to dig around in that data and find interesting stuff to talk about in the blog and in presentations and things like that, which was really fun because it kind of built on what I've been doing on Apple, in the sense that, again, it was looking at apps and smartphones and tablets and stuff, but now with this super huge data set and without Apple's, super duper privacy concerns about, not revealing confidential stuff.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, that you were there for, that was just
about a year.
A year, yeah. And then you mentioned, obviously, the role at Apple was kind of in the pipeline the day after you left. Going back, what was your role then? Was quite a lot higher up, and you actually built a team as well.
Yeah, so what happened was, what I was told when I left and what I ended up doing when I came back is, weirdly for Apple, until that point, Apple hadn't done its own customer satisfaction surveys, it had outsourced them, which is super weird for Apple from two standpoints. One, like, they're very sensitive about anything that's customer facing, which that is. Two, they're super sensitive about any kind of customer data, which that also is, so theoretically, vendors out there would have known how much people like their iPhone, which is something that Apple really, would like to keep to itself. And so there was a mandate at some point that this has to be brought in-house. And so essentially it was creating a small market research company within Apple. And since people knew that I had started a market research company before and knew how to do, there was nobody at Apple at that point, surprisingly, that knew how to do kind of the mechanics of how do you do research. They were used to buying research, but they weren't used to going out and doing it themselves. And so my mandate was first to start that team to be able to do that. And as part of that, because Apple runs surprisingly lean for a company as big as it is, we had to do a huge volume of surveys with a small number of people. So that was one challenge of it. And then part of it also was bringing, again, kind of greater analytical rigor and also the integration of data. So my experience at Flurry meant that I'd been used to dealing with analytics data, but I also knew survey data. And there's just a lot of power in bringing those two sources together. And so that was part of it too, is not just looking at market research as we do surveys when we do focus groups, but being able to take all those different data sources and combine them, synthesize them.
And so that, again, like I said, that was about a year
2 years.
2 years. Okay, 2 years. And then decided to come back
Yeah.
to New Zealand. What was the driver behind that? Obviously, you were in San Fran working for Apple, running a team, and
Yeah, there were a couple of things. I think I'd always intended to come back. It was always a question of when. I think I've always had this sort of tension whereby in my ideal world I would live here and work there. But sadly, no teleporting, can't do that yet. And so I've always kind of tried to figure out how to strike that balance. But I was feeling like I built my team, and that was really fun, and we put in all of this automation and things like that, and that was really fun. And it was all kind of going well, and it felt like a good time to kind of step back because they would be okay without me. And like the level of, I kind of like doing new stuff, and the level of incremental new stuff was going to be limited for several years anyway.
Yeah.
And at the same time, my dad had died a couple of years before. My mom's health problems were better. She'd had cancer, and the cancer was in remission. My brother's kid was better. So all of those family reasons for having to be in the U.S. were sort of gone. And came back at Christmas time a year ago and just, thought, I like having a life as well. I like life here. And yeah, it's kind of feeling like it's time to think about coming back.
Yeah. So you decided to move back to Wellington. This was super recent as well, like December.
Just before Christmas,
Yeah.
yeah.
This Christmas just gone as
Yeah,
well. So super recent on being back. How do you feel the differences? Like obviously, ridiculous differences, I'm guessing, but in terms of working in Silicon Valley and how fast paced and how the startup ecosystem is there compared to moving back to Wellington. Obviously, you've been back a few months now. You've probably had a chance to kind of scope out what's going on.
Yeah.
The differences between the two, like.
Yeah, I mean, the pace is completely different. I think for better and for worse, right? I mean, part of the thing that made me want to come back is people here just have a better work-life balance. But it just means people there are working crazy hours. And the other thing I think that's been super noticeable to me, maybe even more than that, is kind of the size thing. Like Flurry was very much considered a startup, and Flurry had more than 200 people when I worked there. Flurry is in the South of Market area of San Francisco, if anybody knows that, and that's kind of startup epicenter, right? And lots of companies there have hundreds of people. Most of them have, or many of them have dozens of people. All the ones you've heard of have dozens of people. Most of them have more than 10. They get to that more than 10 stage really quickly. Whereas I was at a thing at Creative HQ in Wellington just the other night, and they started their XX accelerator just a week or so ago. And at that launch event for that, they were presenting some data about, their previous companies. And of the successful companies that were still going, the average number of employees was like 3.5, and the average amount of investment was like 450,000. And on the one hand, you think, well, good for those people. It is 3.5 people that they're employing, and it is $450,000 that they raised. But if you think of what you can actually do with 3.5 people and $450,000, compared to like the sort of investment in people that are in some of those startups in San Francisco, I think that's the difference. Like I think people here are every bit as smart and ambitious and things like that, but what I really saw at Flurry and some of those other startups there is the power of you get 10 super smart people together and a few $1 million behind you. What can you do with that? Because I think a lot of it is the interaction of smart people. I mean, same thing with Apple, just on a bigger scale. It's like just having that many smart people together can accomplish a lot more than the sum of the parts.
Okay, and I mean, so especially as Wellington's probably considered maybe a bit more of a startup ecosystem than Auckland at the minute. You've been up here now. This is the first time you've been up since you've been back to Auckland. Is that
apart from the day that I got here and picked up my car.
Exactly, and I know you've met with a few people today and stuff like that. Like, how do you feel like Auckland, from what you've seen, like pretty much today, and from what you've been speaking about with people compared to Wellington at the minute? Like, does it feel like Wellington is definitely more? There's more startups happening down there. There's more events and stuff going, or is Auckland kind of where it's happening?
Yeah, I think my perception, and I've only been back a couple of months, so I don't know how accurate this is. Wellington has always felt, and maybe this is even more true now, it's almost like 3 different places that are in one place, in the sense that you have the government people, you have the sort of startup-y, techie people, and then you have the creative people. And there's a little bit of overlap, but it's surprisingly almost like 3 places going on at the same time. I feel like Auckland, to me, the dominant force is the corporates, with the startups kind of being a lesser thing, that they're sort of there under the surface. And it does feel like I'm amazed and surprised and pleased at how many people are here. I didn't realize that there was as big of a startup community here, especially given like how bad traffic is here and like what an ordeal it is to go places. So the fact that you're all here is wonderful.
If there's any empty seats, it's probably because of the traffic as well.
Yeah, so that's awesome. But I mean, I guess the corporates to me like kind of dominate attention here, and so maybe that's why I just don't know as much about the startups here.
So do you think it was definitely the challenge that intrigued you as well, of coming back? And obviously for anyone that doesn't know as well, so Mary's come back and started a company called Market Truths, which is really aimed at working with startups. Would you say just startups, or are you working across the board?
It was still kind of figuring it out. I mean, and that's part of, I think like I could have stayed at Apple and just done what I'd been doing and made a lot of money doing what I've been doing, but been kind of bored.
Yeah.
Where I think what I wanted to do is really think about what I want to do next. And I kind of know what that area is, but know less about the specifics of how I want to apply it. So to explain basically, one of the things that I really noticed when I was running my market research company here, and has struck me even more so when I've been in Silicon Valley, is we now have big data, and we have all of these fancy tools for working with big data. But one of the things I noticed, even in these big fancy companies, is that the managers who are dealing with making decisions in those companies, they're not really doing anything more sophisticated than they were 20 years ago. They've got their gut and they've got Excel and they're going for it on that basis. Meanwhile, they've got some guy in another room doing this fancy machine learning model. But those sides, the gulp gap between them has become so big that they can't even talk to each other. They can't ask the right questions. And I thought that was super fascinating, that that's happening even in big, powerful companies. And I thought, well, if that's the case there, it's even more the case here, because when I'd been doing market research and working with companies here, it was amazing how you would go in and you would talk to decision makers, and it would kind of be like, well, I asked my mom, I asked my wife, I asked the neighbor down the street, and on that basis, we are going to make our product this way or sell it at this price. And it just seemed kind of unbelievable that was happening. And I think like if that's what you're doing, and somebody else is over here with a fancy machine learning model, and they're adapting their pricing, and they're adapting their promotion, they're adapting their product based on actual information about what millions of people are doing, you're not long for this world. And so there seems like a lot of opportunity to kind of bridge that gap, and that's kind of the basic area that I'm interested in, as it applies to startups, also as it applies to bigger companies too. And so I've sort of been trying to figure out, where is the point of entry into that market? Because I almost feel like where things are here is it's so far removed from people's consciousness that they kind of don't even know that they have that problem yet. Like it's almost like what you were saying before about seeing something early. So I can see that train coming, and it's going to run those people over. But how do you tell a person that has no idea that there's a train, let alone that it's aimed for them, that they need to do something right now? And so it's sort of figuring out how to address that problem, like what contribution to that I can make.
Because you've got the two sides to that as well. You've got the larger corporates that are probably sitting on all that data, haven't been using it or even know that they have it a lot of the time and what to do with it. But you've also got the startups that can know and can use that to, even at smaller scale, to disrupt those bigger guys. So it's almost, so you've got the 2 points of entry there of you can go for the startups and take down the kind of larger corporates, or kind of preempt it with those guys?
Well, particularly I think what the real opportunity is, and I think like that's why I'm really happy to be here talking to all you guys, is to me it seems like there's an opportunity to fundamentally change what sort of businesses are in New Zealand. because it's always seemed kind of crazy that a lot of the economy here is built on, schlepping heavy stuff to other parts of the world. When we care about the environment and, that's not so good and it's expensive to do that, and also kind of transporting people here. Where if you think about digital data-driven products, the whole thing of being here goes away. It's kind of like me being next to the BBC in Second Life, but in this case, it's anybody here can sell anything to anyone anywhere if that thing is a digital thing. There's no problem of how heavy it is and you've got to get it on a container ship and it's going to take 3 months to get somewhere else. So I think if people here were thinking ambitiously about that sort of thing and what kind of products can we make here that could be, the next Google or Facebook or something like that, there's no reason that a company like that couldn't be based from here. And I don't think that will be a big company that makes, I don't think all of a sudden that's going to be Fonterra tomorrow that they're going to say, forget the cows, we're going to do virtual cows. I think it's going to be some smart startup that's going to do something like that.
So how early in the process, there's a lot of early stage founders and stuff here. How early do you really start thinking about data? Is it right from the start? Do you let it drive product decisions, or in your mind is it something you really start with at the beginning and really start iterating from an MVP or just an experiment or something like that?
Yeah, I think that there's three possibilities. I think the biggest opportunity is in a data product, like you think of as Zero or something like that. And at that point, you've got to be thinking of it right from the beginning for two reasons, because that is your product. And also I think that will require more than the 3.5 people and the $450,000. I think it's somebody having a big ambitious idea and saying, we're going to spend more than a weekend thinking about this and we're going to really get it right, but we're planning a global product right from the beginning. So I think there's that. Then I think secondarily, there's products that have a big data component and are very much driven by that. So you're either customizing the product, you're customizing promotion, you're building a lot of that data into what your product is, and so that's maybe you've got a little bit longer, but that's pretty early in the piece too. But then the last one, as you were saying, everybody's got data, or many companies, big and small, have data that they're just not using to its full potential. I think the biggest place where that happens is data gets collected for one purpose, but then really, if you think about it, can be used for other purposes. So you think about something like transaction data. Well, you've got to collect that data because you've got to figure out, how much money people are paying you and how much money they need to pay you. But that information is like a treasure trove of other things about who buys what stuff. So if you're not using it for that secondary purpose, you're going to lose out eventually probably to somebody who is.
And even utilizing it, we spoke a little bit before, and I'll email out, Mary wrote a really good blog as well, covering some of the stuff we've spoken about, and definitely in a lot more detail. I'll email that out pretty much to everyone that's attended tomorrow. But we spoke a little bit on it before about how maybe underprepared as a whole kind of managers are, and you mentioned it as well. So you've got people mining this data and all this data, but then the people in charge of making those decisions maybe aren't ready to use it or ready to listen about it. In terms of New Zealand, from what you've seen so far being back, how underserved is it? And we spoke about the number of people, even with the job title of data scientists on LinkedIn, compared to other parts of the world, like the States or something.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem. The report that Greg's talking about was, McKinsey did a report maybe 4 years ago, and it was looking at the shortage of data scientists, and this was in the US, and they were saying in the US there's a shortage of about 150,000 data scientists and about 1.5 million, from memory, managers who are good at working with data. And the blog post I did was looking at what's kind of happened in those last 4 years, and there's been a lot in terms of analytics. There's a lot of degree programs in analytics now in the US, many more than there were before. There's many more jobs in data science advertised. There's more people in LinkedIn with data science titles. But what I was looking at is, well, what has happened with the managers? And I thought, well, one proxy for that is looking at, are people searching for data? Are they searching for data-related terms? And it turns out the answer is no. No more than they were back 4 years ago. And that, what I was kind of looking for is some more objective evidence that kind of would confirm or refute my own observations, which was that there wasn't much changing, which kind of makes sense because if you think about a lot of people running companies today, were educated way before any of these things existed. They don't really understand them. They think like maybe at best, well, I've hired a data scientist, done. And that's, I feel like, where, you know, the experience that I went through with the web and with Second Life is kind of useful because the same exact thing happened. People would say, oh, I've heard about these website things. Intern, go make one, you know. Company geek, go do that Second Life thing for us. Even, you know, Twitter, Facebook, all of those things, that's what happens at first. Somebody in charge finally hears about it and has some really low-level person decide to go and do it. But that person isn't integrated with the strategy of the company. They don't know what the objectives are. The decision maker doesn't know anything about the details of the technology and how to use it best. So you've got this big breakdown. So I think that that's still a real problem. And my sense here in a lot of the conversations that I've had since I've been back is kind of what I suspected, which is, if anything, it's worse. In fact, I was having this conversation with somebody who serves on a lot of boards here. And she was saying, you know, people on the board level don't know anything about numbers beyond financial statements. They know sort of the accounting numbers, but they don't know analytics. In fact, one story that she told me was that this particular person sits on the board of Radio New Zealand, and she was saying that at least until recently, Radio New Zealand had no analytics. And specifically, they have like a measure that will measure radio audience, but they didn't have any measure of, say, how many people were listening on podcasts. So all of us who listen on podcasts, not counted at all. And you think of that in terms of their metrics, where listenership is so important, and it's kind of crazy. But yeah, my sense is that companies here are even further behind in terms of embracing that. That's also from when I was doing research stuff, because it was pretty clear a lot of the people, even in senior positions, kind of didn't understand the value of even survey data, let alone now analytics data.
So how are you, for your business at the minute, obviously the scope is huge of clients you could go after, and is it more for you now trying to educate, like for a lot of people, especially if you start a consultancy or something like that, like when we had Trent speak, he said a lot of it at the start when he started his UX and usability consultancy, 10 years, 15 years ago almost, it was having to educate people on why they should buy it and why they should be interested in this, and then signing up as a client. Is it now similar for you? Are you thinking, right, my kind of go-to-market strategy is I need to educate these people on how to use data effectively before I can even consider them actually paying me money for it? Or
yeah, I think like it's got to be a combination, and I think I kind of learned this from the first time around doing the survey stuff, because back then, I mean, people didn't know much about market research, and they kind of thought they knew in the sense that they knew how to ask questions and things like that. But that job of like telling somebody that they need to be doing something differently is hard and not terribly lucrative. So I think that this time, what I'm smarter about is, I think that message needs to get out, but I think it needs amplification. So that's why, like right before this, I met with people from Callahan Innovation, because I almost think it needs like the institutional manna of something like that to kind of push the message. And also, I mean, another thing that I've learned over time is stuff like that goes over better in a Kiwi accent than an American one. So I think something like Callahan Innovation saying that as an institution is going to have a lot more of a bigger effect than me as an individual saying that. But at the same time, I would love to be able to work with them on that. And then once the people see that they have the need, then work with them on helping to solve that need. So it's a kind of a combination of pushing them along and helping them try to get the big message out, while at the same time helping the people that either already have the idea now or will get the idea.
So pulling back to startup, like to real early stage startups and stuff, and especially a lot of people here are running either SaaS products or tech startups. What advice would you give on how, I mean, we kind of covered how early to start looking at it, but how to utilize that data effectively when you are in maybe a 2-person, 3-person startup? Like who's in charge of that, or is it everyone's job to be really skilled on the analytics and know where to look and how to use it?
Yeah, I'd say a few things. One, I'd say even for the 2 or 3 person startup, especially if what you have in mind down the road is very much of a data-driven business, really think about your architecture now. One of the big lessons from Flurry was, Flurry, as I was mentioning, does app analytics. And so it had optimized its structure originally for telling an individual app developer, here's how things are going with your app. So the data had kind of been set up to do that, but its strategy all along was to monetize through advertising, so using all of that data to figure out what ad to show you right now. But the way that you structure data for that first use case, for telling the app developer how their app is going, is completely different than how you would structure the data if what you want to do is like what I was doing at Apple and telling advertisers, here's how people who use this particular product are using their smartphone. And so for Flurry to do both of those things at the scale that it had become at that point was really hard. Like by the time you have as much data as they had, picture lots and lots of big Hadoop clusters, to kind of pivot that data around is not like pivoting an Excel spreadsheet or something. It's a big, big task. And so I think if you have ambitions to be big, you really want to think about, okay, what does our data look like when we're really big? How do we structure it now so that that infrastructure is right so we can scale it up and we don't reach a stage where it gets to this point, but that structure just isn't going to hold up. And I know like a lot of the startups in San Francisco kind of go through this where they get to a certain stage and whatever they've done in terms of their infrastructure, it gets you to here, but all of a sudden to get to the next level, there's got to be this big retrofit because it's just not going to support it. So I think really thinking about what does a long-term structure look like and then start to build from there, even though it seems a long way away at the time. And then I think the other thing is starting to think about, well, what are our objectives as a business? What data do we have that would help us, understand the decisions that we're trying to make, that would help us achieve those objectives? Do we have that data now? Yes, no. If we don't, let's work on getting that right now. Because again, it's much easier to build that in right from the beginning than to kind of retrospectively go and get it. And then the other thing that I think is super important is making sure that everybody in the organization understands like what data you have, what different things mean, and is using the same language about it. Because again, I've been in these situations where 2 parts of an organization are both working with data, but either they're calling the same thing something different, or they're calling 2 different things the same thing. And there's these crazy misunderstandings that can happen that way. And I think one of the beauties of a small company is to kind of work some of that stuff out ahead of time so that it doesn't bite you later down the road.
Yeah. And obviously you're classing data as well as quantitative and qualitative. Do you still think web surveys have a part to play? Or?
Yeah, because I think that different types of data do different things. And so for stuff like behavioral things, how many times a day do you check the calendar app on your phone? Passive data, so much better, because who knows? You're going to give a dumb answer in a survey because you don't know and you don't care. But for attitudinal things, how do you feel about your phone? Well, there's no passive measure that's going to tell that. We can tell that you might spend longer than somebody else on your phone, but is that because you love it? Is that because you have a job in sales? Who knows? So that kind of attitudinal stuff, purchase intention stuff, there is still some things that you can kind of only get by asking somebody directly. But I think the trick is being smart about what is that, getting that data that way, getting other data from other sources, and then combining them.
So would you use almost the quantitative data first and then qualitative to kind of back up what is happening or why is this happening rather than what's actually happening?
Yeah, well, to me, I guess, again, terminology, I would do it 2 by 2, and I would say I think of things in terms of quantitative and qualitative, but also passively collected and actively collected. So I guess what I would call web surveys typically quantitative, because we're getting hard numbers from them, just the same way that we're getting hard numbers from analytics data. Whereas I would call something like scraping Twitter data as qualitative data, even though it's coming from the web. And I think all of those things have roles. I think that there's a lot of value in doing like the passive methods of data collection and seeing what you get. and then using the more active measures to try to figure out why. You know, like the analytics will often give you the what, but not the why. You know, so people who buy this are also buying that, but you can't see any possible connection between this and that, even though you've checked their demographics, you've checked all kinds of other things. Well, at that point, maybe ask, because maybe there's some underlying thing that if you only knew that, oh, it's because they all have this habit or they all have this lifestyle or something like that, well, now that opens up lots of other opportunities for you, but there's no way that you're gonna know that unless you go, you know, talk to some people about that.
All comes into how small, I guess, the numbers you're actually looking at. If you're talking passively, you know, if you're split testing and you're only A/B testing with 20 people or so, it's going to be skewed, and it probably makes a lot more sense to actually just ask why and what's going on.
And in any of those kinds of things too, I mean, it matters a lot who the 20 are. Yeah. So if you've got a website and you've completely randomly assigned who the 20 are, well, you know, bigger numbers would be nice, but that's still going to be okay. If they're your 20 best friends or the 20 people in your address book, less good, right? Because they're more like you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think we'll open it up to now questions from the audience. So,
So my name's Nick Costa from Brainmates in Sydney. One of the things I'm interested from a product management perspective is actually how you see data being used to not proceed with a decision as opposed to validate a decision in the marketplace, and how easy that is for many of the founders or the people you've worked with.
Yeah, I think that that's super important to get the no as well as the yes. And I think one way of doing that, and I think this is a good practice for other reasons too, but is thinking through ahead of time, if we get this result, what will we do? And I think that's always a good practice for any kind of data thing, because it also prevents you going just on a fishing expedition for no particular reason, but that it's interesting. You know, if you say, okay, we're going to do this, if we, you know, get a satisfaction level of at least 80%, we're going ahead. If it's less than, you know, if it's between 60 and 80, we'll revise the product and check again. If it's less than 60, we're ditching it. You know, having that kind of a thing ahead of time prevents people from after the fact doing a lot of post hoc justification of like, oh, they were crabby or they just didn't understand what we were going for or something like that.
I have a question that relates to what you mentioned about structuring the data initially, you know, when you're sort of before you launch the startup. So in a practical sense, like what do you actually do? I mean, do you sort of, you know, kind of, is it the database you choose? Is it kind of the tools you use? I mean, what do you mean by that? Like, how do you structure it initially to sort of grow?
Yeah, so I think it's thinking about what do we look like long term? What are we trying to do with that data? And then the implications in terms of, I mean, part of it is even kind of what's your core unit of analysis? Because if you think about that, it's going to drive a lot of things, right? It's going to drive what you're optimizing for. It's going to optimize choices of tools and stuff like that. But if you start with that basic principle of long term, we want to be able to do X, Y, Z, and then work backwards from, okay, if that's our long-term goal, then what tools help us do that? Within those tools, you know, how do we index? How do we set up tables and everything like that?
Okay, but I mean, it would be pretty hard to have that skill set in a small startup, wouldn't it? You have to have kind of outside advice to make it happen, right? So I mean, how do you get that kind of level of knowledge? Like, you know, that's a pretty specialized field.
Yeah, I think it depends on, maybe it's a little bit on what kind of company you have. I think for some, if it's a data-driven product, you might have that internally. If not, if it's like a different kind of product, but you're trying to think ahead like that, I do think that that's a point at which, you know, even though I know startups don't like to spend money and get advice, I think at that point it's worth doing, right? Because it's one of those things where ounce of prevention, pound of cure, in the sense that spending a little bit of money then might just save you a whole lot of heartache down the track, or just being kind of stopped in your tracks. I mean, I think that's the big thing. Like Flurry, for example, if I go back to them, was scaling so quickly that every year before Christmas, app traffic really peaks at Christmas time because everybody gets new devices and downloads a bunch of apps and plays with apps over Christmas. Every year before Christmas, there was kind of this thing where Flurry would like go, what do we have to do to make sure that the platform doesn't fall over Christmas? And there'd be this big effort in hardware and software to make sure that that didn't happen. But it's kind of like preventing something from where your success kind of kills you because you haven't planned ahead and all of a sudden, you know, you get popular and your system crashes. So I do think it's worth paying for that advice at that point, especially because at that point, it might not be a lot of time for somebody who really knows that kind of stuff and can go in and say, okay, this is what you're trying to do, this is what it looks like now, I recommend this, let's check in every 6 months or something and make sure that that's still working for you, and make small tweaks along the way rather than getting to that crisis point and then having to do some big overhaul at a point when you don't want to do it.
For a really early stage startup, would you look at assigning kind of what you were touching on? Is there one person in like a 2 or 3 person startup that you would be like, okay, you've got the right like mix of skills that that you're going to look after our data and then report back to us, or is it everyone in the organisation that has to kind of get to grips with this to be able to know how to use it and use it effectively?
I think a little bit both. I mean, I think in that sort of 2 or 3 person situation, somebody probably has to own it because not everybody can do everything. But I would think that it's super important for that person to be talking to the other 2 people, because at that stage, I mean, if you can't have the business side and the technical side talking to each other with 3 people, you've got trouble later. So making sure everybody's on the same page then. Also just as a redundancy thing, right? Because, I mean, if you've got 3 people and one person's in charge of your data and that person goes or is run over by a bus, you know, you're in trouble. So at least having the other people understand what's going on with it, even though that person owns it.
With the other side of that, obviously the kind of flip side of how busy, I guess, everyone is involved in a startup, like you would prioritize data really early on and have someone ahead of time looking at how they can experiment, how they can extract that, and what they're looking for in that data right from the get-go, pretty much is what I was saying.
Yeah, because you think about something like in kind of iterative startup development, if you think of something like as simple as A/B testing, you know, you've got all of these decisions that you're trying to make along the way about, you know, should we have this feature or that feature, that kind of stuff. I mean, that just lends itself to A/B testing, which is a data thing in and of itself. So it seems like at that point, you know, everybody should be thinking about that kind of thing because you're all involved in the decisions about do we do A or do we do B.
And it's kind of as well, like touching on that, I mean, it can be anything from even just the feedback loop is data, just collecting from 2 or 3 people early on how they're using it and feeling about it. Like even just capturing that is really early stage data that can drive product decisions, but also kind of drive where the business goes as well.
Yeah, and in many cases, like you have this data already, even if you're in a startup and you're not thinking about it, especially these days. I think it's different than it used to be, but almost every startup has a website, right? So if you don't have Google Analytics and you're not using that data, you know, that's a missed opportunity. Same thing, anybody who's got an app, you should have app analytics, and you should be looking at that data. And so I think also if you kind of start at that base, and it's easier to keep adding other stuff in. And if you're not using that stuff, it just seems like you're disadvantaging yourself, and why would you do that?
Intercom is also a really good tool, by the way, like for capturing data, qualitative and quantitative really early on. Intercom is awesome if you're running a SaaS business. Yep.
I'm just kicking off actually a coaching and consultancy that's to do with supporting startups to go to market. In terms of the data that some of the startups I'm working with are collecting, how important do you find things like measurable KPIs, so regular, you mentioned checking points every 6 months or so? Are there any tools or so on that you've found work really well to help startups and measure that sort of data?
I think the tricky thing with standard tools for that sort of stuff is that you really do want them customized to that business. So for example, if you're an app developer and the app is the business as opposed to the app being an adjunct to the business, then there's kind of some standard metrics in terms of things like retention and new users and that kind of stuff. But if it's a completely different type of business, then I think you want to think about what is that business trying to do, and then setting KPIs for that business and kind of customizing them a little bit to that business. But other than that, in terms of a tool that supports that kind of customization, I don't really know of one.
That's good.
Yep.
Thinking about that scaling problem from a very small company that maybe doesn't have the capability to do really sophisticated analytics, and thinking about what data would they want in the future as they scale, and then going back and kind of having that crap moment and trying to figure out how to now go and grab that data. If you have any specific cases where there was a company that discovered, we need this data, how do we get it now, and what use that was to them, just to bring a little bit more specific detail to the discussions that have been, and the questions that have been coming.
Yeah, I mean, the one that I know best, and partly because it caused me so much pain, was the Flurry one, in the sense that, as I mentioned, like, all of Flurry's data, and at this point, like, trillions and trillions and trillions of records were organized by the app user session. So every time somebody opened an app, that one session and what they did in the app was recorded in their main HDFS table as a record. So everything was organized according to that usage session. But for a lot of what we wanted to be able to talk to advertisers about, we really wanted to know about each user as an individual. So what about moms? What about millennials? What about sports fans? But to aggregate the data that way, to go from like the session in an app to the app usage by an individual, was a really hard problem, because what you had to do is go through this huge, enormous table to find the sessions that had people that corresponded to whatever group you were interested in. And that, for that data, what was horrible. It just literally couldn't do it, because you would use so much computational time that either they would have had to kind of get massively more hardware, or the whole thing would just grind to a halt. It just wasn't feasible at all. So we at that point had to go to a sampling solution to do that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's frustrating because you have all this data and now you're sampling it because you can't process it. And yet all along in that case, Flurry's business model all along had intended to be monetizing the data through advertising. But it was kind of like we need to get the developers going first, we need to get the analytics going, we'll worry about that stuff later, but that is a big headache.
So was it a case that the storage of the data was the best fit for the tools available to gather the data, and then the usage of it was kind of secondary and further down the track? Like, what was the point in the path of the business where they figured out, oh, we actually need this other view on the data, and now it's a real pain to go and get it?
Yeah, because the initial rush was to get the app developers to sign up, right? And to provide the service to them, because you don't have the data until you have all of these app developers using their analytics services. So it was initially very much to optimize in terms of being able to get that information for developers. The developers want quickly, because they want to see, if they're doing A/B testing, they want to know right away, did A work or did B work, so they can go on to the next thing. So it was all optimized for speed and efficiency as far as the app developer goes, but it wasn't optimized for speed or efficiency as far as the advertiser goes. And it's hard to do both of those things, but I think the feeling was, for now, we're concentrating on the app developers. Once we get critical mass, and this is kind of common in many business models for many companies, of, we'll worry about the users and then we'll do the monetization after. But if that's what your strategy is, and you've not done your data in a way that's going to make it, that second phase, that monetization phase, feasible, then you've got a real problem. And it was, in that case, kind of like wrestling the data into submission to get it to work for the way that the company was actually making money.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
We've probably got time for one more question. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how did the Silicon Valley companies go from 1 to 10 to 200 employees? Where is it just like you have a bunch of former Googlers who are like, oh yeah, let's start a company and throw $1 million here?
Yeah, I actually started wondering that myself when I saw that 3.5. Like, how does it happen? Like, I don't know any 3.5 person companies in San Francisco, or 3-person for that matter. And I think it is partly just the amount of money that's sloshing about. Like, I think here, the angels and stuff like that, there's a lot of them, but they don't have much money, and they're trying to hedge their bets, so they're taking a smaller amount of money and slivering it up a bunch of different ways. Whereas there are a lot of people who've gotten a ton of money out of big IPOs and things like that, and they've got a lot of money to invest, so they can get like their friends. That seems like a lot of it, and they're not getting 2 friends, they're getting 10 friends to begin with. So there's that, and then I even think that their first round of funding, they're getting enough funding so that you can get 10 people working on a problem or something like that. And I don't know how you shift the ecosystem here, but I would bet that having a third of the companies, but them being 3 times as big right out of the box, would increase the success rate. Because that's I think one big lesson that I learned from my time in Silicon Valley is just that power of getting a bunch of smart people in the room and the cross-fertilization of ideas, and also just the critical mass of being able to do a whole bunch of things simultaneously. Because you think about it, if a 3-person company has a great idea, what are the odds that they have a chance to develop that idea fully and get those additional rounds of funding before somebody steals that idea? You know, in this day and age, I think that that's a real risk.
How do we convince investors that that's the right way to go?
but there is just a lot of money, and in terms of like the people, I mean, everybody talked about how when WhatsApp got bought by Facebook, everybody talked about how small they were, but that was like 50 people when WhatsApp got bought by Facebook, and that was still a new, small company.
In terms of the ecosystem here, I mean, access, do you think a lot of it, as some of the discussions I've had, a lot of companies, especially and startup founders in New Zealand, set out to service a problem in New Zealand and maybe don't think of the wider demographic. They're just stoked to be able to launch something that's New Zealand based, and maybe don't think of opportunities overseas from the bat. So they do maybe take 2 or 3 friends at the start, push for enough money to get them clients in New Zealand, and then before that's happened, like before they've managed to get overseas, something else has happened. Or is it just a point of them not moving fast enough, or mentality, would you say, so far? Or?
Well, I think there's both. I think that there is definitely like a lifestyle thing. Like I have to admit, when I was coming back, when I had this idea for an app, and I think it's a good idea, and it would work really well here. And I was kind of thinking about that. And then I was having a chat with one of the investors in Wellington, not like pitching it or anything, but just telling him about my different possibilities, and this is one thing I'm thinking about. And he said, like, you know, how much per customer? And I'm saying, I don't know, you know, and I'm just doing this all the top of my head because I hadn't really put much thought into it at all. And the essential point that became clear in like 10 minutes of conversation was, for an investor to be interested in that, you would have to want to scale it. And that was a particular business that you could. But I'd kind of been thinking about it as like, oh, this would be fun to do, and it would be nice. But I think like it is the investor's job at that point to say, well, nice for you. If you just want to go and do that for fun, go. But if you want me to invest, then you've got to be thinking globally because there isn't enough market here. But I think that's where they could also push and say, you know, don't bring me an idea that has a total addressable market of 10 million. Bring me a $1 billion idea. And it seems like if you've got a $1 billion idea, then you should be able to get, you know, the resources to make that happen. And I do wonder sometimes if, you know, both the entrepreneurs and the investors here are thinking ambitiously enough about that kind of thing. And I kind of think maybe not, and maybe it's partly like people do just want a kind of lifestyle business that's nice to do, and I totally get that. And maybe it's also just not, you know, taking a big enough leap.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think that's a good point to finish on. So yeah, look, thanks a lot for coming, everyone. That was awesome. That was really good, really insightful. We will hopefully put the video out as well. So anyone, if you wanted to share that with anyone in the organisation, or anyone you're thinking about running a startup with, how important data is at the start and everything that was covered. So we'll give Mary another round of applause for coming down. Thanks.